for 30 years, it was a virtuous cycle. It was very, very beneficial to healthcare providers and to hospitals. And so, first of all, it was driven by the fee-for-service-based payment system, which generated an approach to volume, chase volume. The more you do, the more you get paid. That's very well understood. But what's also part of that is that the volume created a drive for inefficiency. The more inefficient we were, the actual higher the cost structure became, the more we could increase our prices. What protected the inefficiency was opacity. So we had kind of a volume, opacity, inefficiency cycle. Now, why would that be virtuous? And the answer was because the opacity hid our poor quality and our high cost structure. So no one knew. We all assumed the quality was good and the cost was reasonable. And the inefficiency clogged the capacity of the system, which enabled providers to say, you need to pay us more money. We have to increase pricing. Perversely, inefficiency increased hospitals' pricing power because they could say, look how busy we are. So that was kind of in a nutshell the cycle. Now, it used to be very virtuous because it was very beneficial to hospitals. What happened was we reached the limits of pricing power. We reached the limits of healthcare cost growth. And governments and businesses and people were no longer willing to pay prices which kept rising 2 to 3 times faster than the rate of inflation. And also began asking very important questions. Demonstrate the quality. Show me that the costs are efficient. And that then started to render the old virtuous cycle to become vicious. And so now we've got to figure out a way out of that vicious cycle. Well, the next virtuous cycle, just like the first one, which is now the vicious cycle, the next cycle is driven by a change in the payment mechanism. As we move away from volume-based payment and we move to some type of value-based payment, what that does is it shines a light on what used to be hidden by our opacity, which is the fact that our costs are too high, our quality isn't what it could be, our safety profiles aren't very good. And so as a result, the value-based payment changes it, a movement away from focusing on volume, moving away from opacity to transparency, which then forces us to move away from inefficiency to efficiency. And so now the new cycle becomes basically transparency, efficiency, increased capacity. Now that's very, very interesting because what it does is it helps us drive down cost, it helps improve quality. Overall, it's good, but there's a significant challenge to this new vicious cycle, and that is as you become more efficient, you create more capacity. Inefficiency clogs capacity. So the more inefficient you are, the less practical capacity you have relative to your theoretical capacity utilization. So the great problem that many organizations are facing, first of all, is how do I switch from what is now a vicious cycle into the virtuous cycle? But secondly, once we do that, we're going to become more efficient, and suddenly we're going to have excess capacity. And just as in the old cycle, what is now the vicious cycle, inefficiency created pricing power. Efficiency will actually reduce pricing power because you have excess capacity. So organizations will have two choices, and that is they'll either have to get more aggressive and compete in non-traditional markets to attract new business to fill their excess capacity, or they will have to close their excess capacity. And the challenge with that is if everyone in the country does this, we'll have 30% excess capacity, and there won't be enough business to fill the excess capacity for everyone. So it's almost like we're in a race, or to use another metaphor, in a game of musical chairs. And the market will reward those organizations who can change first and the fastest, who can demonstrate the highest quality, the lowest cost, the greatest transparency, who will then be able to attract commercial business from outside their geographic markets, who will be attracted by their low cost, their high quality, and their safe care. What boards and leaders can do first is recognize the kind of changing hydraulics of the movement from one cycle to another. Very, very important to understand that. Secondly, what they can do is ask some very penetrating questions. What is our quality? What is our costs? What is the degree of variation that we have in organizations? Because variation is the handmaiden of inefficiency. And what we see is organizations that have 4 or 5 or 6, sometimes 20 or 30 different ways of doing the same thing. treating a bacterial pneumonia, replacing a knee. Those are the ones that have clogged capacity and high inefficiency. So the first thing that boards and leaders need to do is to see the inefficiency which they have become accustomed to, see the poor quality that they have become accustomed to. They must become the spotlight of transparency by first asking the questions. What is our price? How much would it cost? And what I advise boards to do is pick up the phone, pretend they're a patient, call their hospital and say, I need to have a hip replacement. I need to have a knee replacement. I need to have a hernia repaired. How much will that cost? How much? And most of them will be surprised to find out that they cannot get an answer to that question, simply because we don't know, or organizations don't know. So beginning to push to that direction, number one, convince themselves that there's a problem. We like to think about kind of a three-part approach. Number one, they must see the problem. They must understand the dynamics. Number two, they must own the problem. They must recognize that even though there were outside forces which incentivized or generated this, that the problem really is one of how we're running our own organizations. And then third, then and only then can they fix the problem. So it depends on where they are in that continuum. Some leaders really understand this dynamic, really understand the cycles, and also understand their own cost structures and are aggressively working to become more efficient and then deal with the excess capacity that they're creating. Other leaders don't have any ideas about what their cost structure is or their inefficiency or the degree of variation or the quality. So I would say see the problem, own the problem, and then and only then can they begin to fix the problem.